You're live.
Oh, I'm live. Hi, I'm Anna Smith-Spark. I'm live, slightly terrified, staring at my computer. I'm the author of the Empires of Dust series. I've got a broken nose. Has the Tower of Living and Dying. And has a sacrifice, which is a extremely violent, yet also intensely poetic and lyrical, grimdark, but also high fantasy epic trilogy, been described as a masterwork of dark fantasy and literary Game of Thrones. I'm currently deciding whether or not to read the plague section from the Tower of Living and Dying. I'm not sure whether this is hopefully the only opportunity I will ever have in my life to read the plague section at a convention actually called QuaranCon, or whether that's the most bad taste thing in the universe. So I guess if anyone wants to give an immediate emergency message right now on YouTube saying yay or nay, I'll just consult my Twitter. Any thoughts? Anyone who's watching this? Yay or nay, the plague section? Is that worse than that? Is that just such bad taste I'll never live it down? Or okay, a couple of people have said do it, so let's do it. Let's read the plague section. Pray to Nurgle. This is the only chance, the only time I ever have in my life to read the plague section, which I got disturbingly right at a convention called QuaranCon. Right. So this is the plague. This is a scene from the Tower of Living and Dying, which is the second book in the trilogy. We're in a amazing, absurd, ramped up to 11 fantasy city. It is Byzantium. It's Samarkand. It's Viriconium. It's Minas Tirith. It's just the fantasy city of my dreams. Everything I love about the fantasy city condensed into one city, and it is currently being beset by a terrible plague. Concerning the outbreak of deeping fever in Sorlost, 1,000 explanations were given. The god's anger at the turmoil of the city, the god's anger at the disappearance of the high priestess Thalia, the god's anger at the idiotic blasphemers who believed such a painfully absurd lie. As far as Orhan could see, however, the explanation was glaringly obvious. Cam Tardane's first acts as Nick had been to rescind every restriction on travellers from Che. The Hath addicts and the rose oil merchants and the high lords had all been delighted. March Vernus' death, it would seem, had not been entirely in vain. Orhan occasionally wondered, all I did, all my crimes, and they brought about my dismissal as Nick over a travel ban. From the streets of the south and Yellowbird Square, the disease spread like floodwater. The Gold Quarter, the bloody echoes, the dead harbour, starlight by the gateways, the street of bones and longing, the port of evening sorrows, the port of the broken knife. The air rang with screaming, bodies piled up in alleys and doors, people running mad to escape watching their children dying, fighting to drink at the fountains to cool their fevered heat. Death stench began to permeate even the seclusion of private gardens. The rich locked themselves away and burned mint and lavender and Sidious berries. The poor staggered about with rags clutched over their mouths. For the first few days, bizarrely, predictably, the city had seemed entirely unconcerned. People were reported dying, but not real people. Not real people were really dying of something real. They themselves wouldn't get sick and die, or lies anyway, another attempt by someone to cause alarm. Someone would start saying next it was called by the ex-Nick, or the dead high priestess, or the dead Outresit king. Then panic. Cam Tardane ordered the Emperor's soldiers out into the streets to board up plague houses. A man fell down in a pool of his filth in the court of the fountain. cursing great Panis and the emperor as he died. A woman killed her 3 children in the grey square on the steps of the great temple, screaming she would rather cut their throats than see them take sick. People crowded into the temple, trampled the children's bloodstains underfoot, lit candles scented with herbs and spices, gave offerings of jewellery, said endless begging prayers. The cost of lavender and cisseus berries and mint leaves doubled. Good candles cost a silver dole each. People began to hoard bread. The numbers dying started subsiding. God had answered their prayers. Sir Kemneth Empire would stand against any dangers. The Lord of living and dying protected them. The Escalimi Emperor loved his subjects. What was mere illness, besides the power and wealth of the golden empire of the eternal city of Solost? The gates were barred to Chathian travellers. The price of lavender and cisseus berries and mint leaves halved. The disease flared up again, more savagely than before. Rumour had it that half the population of Fair Flowers was dead or dying. Children wandered the streets crying for their parents. The bakers' shops and food stalls began to close. Lord Caltran took sick. So did Simnion Magreth. The emperor ordered all the doors of his palace locked. Everyone knew the villages of Western Chaith had been the centre of the last outbreak. So everyone from Chaith was sought out and hunted down and killed. Everyone knew the villages of Western Chaith were the chief producers of pather. So hath-eaters were sought out and hunted down and killed. As the days went on, this came to mean anyone with a funny accent or funny clothing, or anyone who was seen publicly rubbing their eyes. The price of lavender and cisseus berries and mint leaves trebled. Good candles cost 5 dol. Even the wealthy began to run short of bread. A fire started in a boarded-up house on the street of the Butchered Horse. The whole street was burned to ashes before it could be put out. Rumour had it that the dying had fought back the bucket chains to hurl themselves into the flames. Amaritha Venchul took sick. Simnion Magreth died. Lavender and cisseus berries and mint leaves were traded for family heirlooms, sexual favours, food. Good candles cost a talent each. People fought in the streets for bread. Bill shut herself in her bedroom with the baby, ordered servants wearing gloves and silk masks to leave food in covered dishes outside the door. She would eat only milk curds, fresh mint leaves and raw gillerfowl eggs, burned lavender oil night and day. The cost would be crippling Orhan. Would he not be certain it would all end very soon when they both died? Through the door he heard the muffled sound of her crying. He wept himself when he thought of the baby kicking its pathetic legs in its clout cloths that would die before it had really been alive. The smell of it, the odd inhuman sounds it made that tore his heart to pieces with love. It seemed so unfair, such an absurd word to use, like every other word in his vocabulary. Language was pointless in the face of such endless disasters. Dead, unfair, sad, hurt. Oh, Orhan, you grow too bitter. Don't you know that bitterness is bad for the blood? You need to keep happy and smiling. That will help you keep your health. Burn lavender flowers and cisseus berries. Repeat the charms of Semethest. Bind to your chest the ashes of peacock feathers dipped in honey. Smile. Keep your pecker up. Live in hope any of this rubbish actually works. It would be nice if Dareth could survive somehow, he thought to himself, occasionally, when he and Dareth went arguing again. And Bill, his sister, the useless lump of his sister's son. Some Ryle's family would probably survive, it occurred to him, since they were safely tucked up in isolated, starving poverty in rural Imish, forbidden to leave their houses. The irony was biting. Tam's death ultimately not in vain. Tam might, Orhan thought in his most generous moments, have been happy to see it end this way for them. His death saving his children's lives. Or not. Let's run away to Imish, Darragh said that evening. They sat in Darragh's splendid bathing chamber, trying not to breathe on each other even as they kissed. We'll never make it. Streams of people crowded the gates each day, running away to Imish. The desert dwellers killed them, or just the desert. If they made it through to Imish, the Great Council had placed armed guards on the road and in the border towns. Safe, sensible precautions, when he'd insisted on doing the same thing for anyone coming into Saw Lost, from Che. Your whore died, said Darragh. What? Your beautiful, beautiful, filthy whore. He died. Like a knife blade, his hand twisting the wound in Tam's belly, squeezing out every drop of pain. I know. Heartbroken, are you? I paid a man a talent to bury him, with a wreath of copper stem round his beautiful, beautiful, filthy neck. A talent for a dead whore. Orhan got up. I think I should go now, Darragh. Run away then, said Darragh, you callous, cheating, cowardly bastard. Got up too, the two of them facing each other, dripping wet, stark naked, warm, sweet-scented to oiled twilight dark, with birds cooing and fluttering in their cages in the walls. Absurd. Had to get dressed before he could go. Further absurdity. Orhan stood in the dressing room, damp and sticky, holding out his arms while a body servant wrapped his clothes around him, sticking to his skin. Just go back, he kept thinking. Just go back into the bath chamber and tell him you're sorry again, like you always do. In the corridor, he heard splashing from the shade pool. Darragh tried to show him how well he could be happy alone. The onyx gate to the Gate of Flowers, the onyx gate to the House of Flowers opened smoothly and silently before him. Carved huge petals of precious stone. The last heat of the sun clung to their surface, butterflies and flies resting, enjoying the warmth. Green lizards with red legs eating the flies. Every time he left now, he imagined it was for the last time. The gates swung closed again, sealing themselves, crowds of flies rising, buzzing, then settling back to bask on the hot stone. There were a lot of flies now in Saw Lost, big and fat. The city of Tyrene was reported a fly-blown wasteland, flies buzzing in clouds over the White House and it. Flies, 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 eating the ruin of the world. I just wanted to make things better, Orhan thought. The streets were largely empty, even in the Street of Flowers. The low, distant background noise of screaming hung in the air like the dust. But the dust, one hardly noticed it. One day soon, thought Orhan, it will stop, and the silence will drive the last few survivors mad. A dead man lay sprawled on the flagstones, hands thrown out, his shirt torn, blood running from the cracks in his head. A Hathor addict, or a Chathin merchant, or one of the Solostian merchants banished from Imish, also somehow being blamed. Or a man selling candles, or lavender flowers, or Sidious berries, or bread. Desperate people will kill for desperate things. Fever and despair are already driving us mad. Orhan walked slowly with his entourage of guardsmen around him, costing him a fortune, and the chances were one of them would go down with it and bring the plague raging into his house. No need for them, given the number of different ways he was dying. But not even a dying man wants to die. He found himself stopping in the court of the fountain, watching the water plashing, silver pale on the marble. Pretty. A warm gust of wind blew water droplets into Orhan's face, cool and sweet. A soldier with a sword stood beside the fountain, watching the few people milling around, still trying to buy and sell and walk about like the world wasn't coming to an end. 4 people had drowned, throwing themselves into the water to soothe their fever. Bad omen. Must be stopped. In your embrace, I dream of water. Orhan skirted round it, trying to avoid looking at the fountain or the man's blade. The grey square, alone in the city, was crowded. People came to the temple day and night to pray and beg. A new rumour had it that the disease could be avoided by lighting a candle or repeating the chant of the sun. It was noticed also that the priestesses were not dying, so this must surely mean something. Orhan wished, like the rest, to believe that it was the god's kindness. Knew really, like the rest, that it was some kind of pious lie. The priestesses wore masks, apart from the high priestess, so no one could really say how many of them there were. A rational man, Orhan Emirath. Arath would even say a cynic, but trying to cling to some broken fragment of hope. Candied lemons, candied roses, candied salted simmer leaves. A street seller, her tray piled high with sweets, all the pretty colours, the yellow green of the lemons, pink rose petals, plump green leaves. Flies, fat and excited, buzzing around her, sated with dead flesh. Some things cost so much now no one could afford them. Other things no one wanted, and their sellers starved. Candied lemons, she called hopelessly. Candied lemons, $1 a bag. Orhan bought 3 bags, handed 2 over to his guardsman, dry and too chewy, not sharp enough. The sugar crunched in his mouth. Thank you, my lord, thank you, she said. Her voice was pathetic. Here, have a bag of roses with my gratitude, my lord. Orhan took the bag carefully, passed that too to his guards. Beautiful big petals, a deep glowing pink like the morning sky. All the flowers were blooming in rich profusion. Like a plant with silver rot, the city seemed to be decking itself in beauty before it died. The square fell silent. From deep within the temple, the twilight bell tolled. Scent of incense on the wind. A sacrifice night. A little girl with old eyes and bloody hands. Every night, a voice shouted from the square. We should be making a sacrifice every night, as we once did. We were a great power then, another voice shouted. Never had the plague. Great Tennis is angry. We neglected the god, and this is our reward. Every night, more voices shouting, every night. And you'd volunteer, would you? Orhan thought. The first voice shouted, I have a daughter. Great Tannis would be happy to see her sacrificed. Strong she is to help the god. Every night, every night, every night. More and more voices. The Lord of living and dying, the living remain living and the dead may die every night. This blasphemy, the high priestess abandoning the temple. Great Tennis is angry every night, every night, every night. God's knives, Orhan thought. Is this now what we've come to? If it makes them feel better, he thought then. He walked on. Empty streets, a knife fighter wounded and panting, sweat clinging to his brow. 2 more fighting together in a courtyard, a handful of spectators gathered round, shouting, chanting one of the men's names. As Orhan watched, the taller figure slipped, stumbling. The other was on him, cutting down hard with his knife. The loser fell back in a mass of blood. His eyes stared round, imploring his audience to help him. Dying, dying, don't want to die. The victor raised his arms, bloody sweat on his forehead, his face fever bright. 2 child whores drifted past the spectators with bells tinkling. Like the knife man, their faces oozed sweat beneath their paint. A man in a green coat pulled one of them roughly towards him. Child's list. One doll, one doll. She's dying almost, Orhan almost shouted. She's dying, can't you see? Man and child went off together down the street into the shadows. The air around them seemed to moan and laugh. Is this now what we've come to? He drifted aimlessly with his guards around him, floating in the golden dust. A group of women kicked a man to the ground on a street corner, shouting that he was a Chathian plague carrier. 2 children ran past, dressed in rags. 2 houses boarded up and screaming. The shop boarded up. The planks had been smashed open to loot the shop. A cloth merchant's, from the look of it. Orhan bent down, picked up a length of vivid pink and gold embroidered silk. Flowers, stems intertwining, the spaces between one picture, the outline of the next. The same colour as the candied petals, the gold thread unravelling in his hand. A beetle was clinging to the embroidery, fat and black, bloodstained. He made a choking sound and dropped it back to the ground. And there we go, my description of the plague, which was written a couple of years ago, inspired, in fact, by accounts of plague in Byzantium. I got some of it right, I'm alarmed to say. Not quite as bad as that, but yeah, there we go. Let's all pray to Papa Nurgle that I never have the opportunity to read that chapter at Quanticon again, ever in my life. Okay, here we are then.
I never do. I'm back as a voice, as a disembodied voice. And I'm scanning our chat for questions, and you may have better luck with your Twitter feed, but I'm not seeing anything yet. But then again, let's announce to people that there's a 20-second delay, first of all.
Ask questions. Oh, yeah, sorry, that was probably, I was really thinking, is that the most tasteless and most depressing thing to have possibly read?
I don't know. I mean, I like the contextually appropriateness of it, make that proper English. But
I mean, the book was written to have obvious political relevance there. Mm-hmm. And in fact, at one point, he actually talks about making Saul. I actually had him quote Trump. He says at one point, he will make Solost great again. So I hadn't realised perhaps quite how relevant it was. I'd actually forgotten about the plague section, slightly bizarrely. It was, I gave a reading a week before the UK went into lockdown.
Oh, wow.
I wasn't quite sure whether I should go, because by then most of Europe was in lockdown. But I went to, it was the last event I did. I think it was the last science fiction fantasy event, possibly in England before we went into lockdown.
Oh, yeah.
I did a reading, and the person who was interviewing me, who I'm actually a civil servant in my other life, and the person interviewing me was also a civil servant, and she was pointing out, she reminded me that I had managed to predict everything. So I have plague, I have as sort of political assassinations and the destruction of the political machinery.
Oh, yeah.
Environmental destruction. And
so we need to ask you to write more uplifting books, I think, is the moral of this story.
It's really bizarre, actually, because I'm a civil servant so obviously at the moment, the entire UK civil service is kind of directed towards how to keep Britain running at the moment and how we get out of this and what we do for everyone who's unemployed. And it is like, it is a bit like, hey boss, I know.
Just make sure you read all the way to the end, because it gets better. Is that I haven't read the book, so I don't know, but
I am kind of thinking maybe I'm going to write another book. I'm going to write a book in which people just do really boring stuff. The high point is when someone does some ironing.
Excellent. Maybe we can get on that universe.
Yes.
Pop ourselves over to that alternate universe where everything's going well. People are just
Yes,
living their lives. Everything's normal and boring.
yes. I think it's a kind of really interesting point for being a dark fantasy author at the moment,
Yeah.
grimdark author. I have had a discussion with several other people who also write similar sort of stuff. Mike Fletcher, if anyone knows Beyond Redemption, Mike Fletcher. About what, on the one hand, the stuff I'm writing feels more pressing than ever. There is a lot of stuff about refugees. There is a lot of stuff about how communities cope with disaster, but then obviously with how you cope your own state with disaster, but then others are also experiencing disaster, possibly worse. How you cope with your state yourself is in a state of collapse, but you have refugees coming from something even worse. There's a lot of stuff in it which I think is really, really important.
Yeah.
And if one person reads it and thinks a little bit about in more complicated ways about the kind of the situation we've been in, that would be wonderful. But at the same time, I can completely see why no one wants to read my books. I mean, I can completely. I think there's some stats at the moment when on Netflix, everyone is watching Friends and Cheers.
Right.
I can completely see why.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I have a humorous urban fantasy series that's doing way better right now than it has in a while, because people are like, where are the fluff reads? Get me the fluff reads.
Yes.
And luckily I've got one.
Unicorns and bunnies and
exactly, yeah.
paladins and kind of.
We do have some questions for you now.
Oh, cool.
One comment is that Kasaravi says that chapter resonates differently now than when I read it in 2019. So, yep. And then a question from the same user. If you were writing the series in the middle of the current crisis, do you think it would have influenced the tone?
I don't know if I've been in the headspace to write it, if you see what I mean. I think I probably actually would now. I don't know, it probably would have influenced the tone. Yes, I think I probably would possibly actually be more positive. I mean, because there is that kind of cynicism in the book. People are when people's response to the plague is very, very cynical. And actually it surprised me in Europe how much we are just going along with this. In England, people's kind of commitment to the lockdown has been absolutely total. It's been slightly frightening, in fact, the other way, how we're all rubbing each other in, basically. I mean, there was these horrible things going around of things like someone actually put up a big sign in their window saying the woman in the flat above me is having friends round.
Oh gosh.
You know, that kind of, and I have it myself. I was in the supermarket the other day and the woman in the queue behind me, she bought a bottle of vodka, a bottle of gin and a whole load of cans of beer. And I was like, she's having a party, isn't she? I mean, she's having a party, like she's having people around, maybe able to say something. And then suddenly I'm like, what is it to do with me? What, you know, just that terror of I'm actually finding myself thinking like, should I find someone in the supermarket and report, you know, maybe this woman's having people round to drink alcohol.
Or maybe she's just stocking up on 2 weeks worth of alcohol.
Yeah, maybe
so she doesn't have to shop every day.
Her other half and 2 adult kids.
Yeah, exactly. She might live with a family of 7 and then what?
But, I think actually we are being much more positive and supportive to each other than I think I probably realised. And it's interesting, I mean, even the kind of the protests that we've been seeing in bits of America, it is very much about people feeling lockdown is awful, but they're not saying, it's not from a point of view of kind of, well, I'm all right, so I don't care about others dying. It's from a very different, not from that into a very, very cynical perspective. So maybe I actually, in a bizarre kind of way, I feel slightly more hopeful about humanity than before we were actually put to the test. We have maybe tested and found slightly better than I thought we might be.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think the world is responding.
Yeah.
Overall, as a world average, I think a lot better than I would have hoped for from a grimdark perspective, or even just a what I worry reality would be. And I feel like the US is showing us signs of like, well, no, yeah, that's what I was worried about. I was worried everyone would do that. And instead we're getting...
They are doing it in a kind of... It's about freedom. I mean, I don't know, maybe we're getting the signs we're seeing about the pictures we're seeing in Europe of what's going on in the US are very much about things like people wanting to go out to work to provide for their families. Still,
right.
people
yeah.
see that it's not that kind of... There was a horrible moment where there was a bit of a discourse around, well, it's only old people and sick people,
Oof, yeah.
who are dying, so hell, just let them die. The economic costs are massive, and they just, it's not like they're actually doing anything productive anyway. And it hasn't.
Oh.
It really, that kind of discourse has not been manifested at all. It's been very much a kind of my freedom to work and provide for my family has been curtailed, which is different. So
right, yeah, and the US government is failing people in a number of ways that way too, right? Because they're not, there a lot of the other countries that are having more successful lockdowns are also providing for people in a way that's more reasonable. I live in Canada. I'm from the US originally, so but I live in Canada, and here there's a big increase in unemployment insurance and everything else, and the government has been very quick, maybe not as quick as people would hope, and I'm sure there's still people falling through the cracks, but trying really hard to make sure that the people who can't work are covered. And the US is just barely coming up with anything remotely sufficient. So it sort of makes sense that people are more, we want a right to work, because they're being hit harder. The government's not stepping up. Anyway, sorry. I don't know. Just suddenly I'm like, oh, we're just having an interesting conversation about the plague.
It is the responses. I mean, I'm a historian. I'm originally a classical historian, so I read a lot about the plague in Athens, the kind of the plague in Byzantium was and the collapse of the sort of incredible decay of the Byzantine Empire was a huge influence on the way I was writing So Lost. And I mean, by the end of the Byzantine Empire, you get this kind of bizarre, they've got this vast decaying city with the population has crashed. Their entire empire, in inverted commas, is kind of 3 miles of land around the city walls, and then the city. They're being constantly by plague, and yet they're still kind of there, heroically attempting to hold off the inevitable, being hit by these endless plagues, and still like, we have an empire of couple of fields. And that I read a lot about sort of plagues and responses to them, and it is really interesting to see now this thing that we've been so totally are not expecting in the slightest,
right?
And we're dealing with it. It's incredible how overnight it is like a science fiction thing. I mean, there's kind of those moments that the change between 2 months ago and now is quite astonishing. And it is for a writer. Of weird things. It is quite astonishing to how quickly it happens.
Yeah, we had a friend who, just before everybody started going into lockdown, we were talking, and we'd gone to visit them. We'd traveled to the US, and they were saying, so it's so weird. I have this feeling that soon we'll be talking about this as before, and just as it being a separate era, that this would be like the last moments of before COVID-19, because we could see it happening already, and it was clear that that's where we were headed, at least to some of us, and it was just a really interesting conversation to think of it that way, and I thought of it that way too. It felt like this. It's like, oh man, life is somewhat normal now, and how much is that going to change? And here we sit a few weeks later, and the answer is quite a lot.
Always survived. Cities have always survived. It's
humans are resilient.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions?
I am looking, and I don't see any at the moment. So and there is a 20-second lag, but I don't.
Come on, people, ask questions. Now's your chance.
you've got.
But what's bizarre, actually, talking sort of reading historical accounts is how much the plague just sort of happens and then everyone almost kind of gets back to normal. It's quite bizarre reading kind of accounts of the plague of Athens, and then you have this great plague in Athens, and then a couple of years later they're cheerfully at war again. It's this kind of just another thing. It's just another thing that happened, and then you move on. It's kind of, maybe this will just be some kind of weird. Yeah, there was that really weird, and there was that even weirder year when they got quite plague. That's kind of, there was that, and then there's the weirder year, and then there was that really weird year.
Yeah. I mean, I hope it doesn't get too much more than this. We're just like, let's hope that in our lifetimes this was just the blip and everything else goes back to. But I have, this, I have a feeling this will become an era somewhat like the Great Depression, where there will be a lot of cultural turns and stuff. You do have a new question now. We've got Chimera Festival asks, what, or maybe Chimera, depending on what. Yeah. What are you working on right now?
What am I working on right now? So I've got a short story coming out in an anthology with a small press called Grimbold Press. They're fantastic. They are not grim, but they are very bold. They're fantastic. Small UK publishing house. They have an anthology called Lost Gods, which unfortunately I think has been delayed by everything. But it's sort of weird short stories based around the theme of lost gods and old gods. And so I wrote a very, very personal short story about, it's about a Silkie. There are Silkies in the Court of Broken Knives. If anyone who doesn't know, Silkies are, in Celtic mythology, they're seal women. And if you catch one, they're rather like, it's a bit like the story of Thetis in the Iliad. If you catch a seal woman and she takes off her seal skin to go and dance on the beach as a woman. And if you catch her skin and take her skin from her, she's trapped as a woman and can't go back in the sea. So it's this sort of story of, fishermen who trap a seal woman, catch her skin, and then they can marry her, which is a fairly obvious, very heavy-handed image for marriage and the kind of women-female imbalance in power relationships and rape. But so I kind of talk a bit about the Silkies in the Court of Broken Knives, but I wanted to write a very personal piece, which is actually just about motherhood and about trying to juggle motherhood and career and wanting to be oneself and be fulfilled in oneself as a writer or as whatever one's career is, with the endless, exhausting, competing demands of motherhood, which again has become incredibly prescient at the moment. That kind of, there's this terrifying statistic. I think some academic journals are saying they have not had a single submission of an academic paper by a woman in the last month.
Oh, geez.
That kind of level. I would imagine a lot of literary agents have had, the number of submissions from women, from new women wanting to try and get an agent has plummeted. Okay. The number of women handing in a completed manuscript, I imagine, has plummeted. The cost to women of the fact that schools have closed has been massive.
Yeah.
So the story is actually so prescient about that, because it is about that trap of, there's this woman who's a Silkie, and if she finds her skin, she can go back to the sea, but her children. Yeah, so that will be published at some point this year. I thought it was going to be published quite soon, but I believe I think the book may have been slightly delayed. So I'm writing more and more this kind of, I'm kind of developing a very kind of personal style writing about my own sense of myself as a woman, writing very kind of personal literary stuff, but just in a high fantasy setting, because that's so much more interesting.
Because it's fun, yeah.
Yes, so much more fun. Right, kind of very, what someone like Hilary Mantel is doing, where she's writing something intensely personal about, intensely kind of complicated about the individual and an individual psyche. it just happens to be in a kind of historical novel setting. I want to do something like, I want to do that more and more in a fantasy setting. I kind of was, by the end of the House of Sacrifice, that really was what I was doing. That's where I'm kind of seeing myself going. I'm probably moving away from writing really intense grimdark violence, because I think I burnt a lot of that out of myself. The Empires of Dust trilogy I really went places in terms of writing about the violence and the kind of nihilism and my own feelings about toxic masculinity and violence. And I want to move on to writing something a bit lighter, maybe fresher, sunnier, but very, very personal and intense and emotionally intense. So that's what I'm looking at doing.
You do have another question.
Cool.
So Kasaravi again says, one scene I particularly remember from the Tower of Living and Dying is the orphan experiencing rain and sore lost. It was really beautiful and haunting. And then the stunning battle scene as well. What would you say is more interesting to write for you? Battle and action scenes, or nature and setting descriptions?
Oh goodness, see, I see them as the same. I don't see any difference. I'm writing descriptive stuff about absolute emotional experience. So for me, there's no difference whether I'm writing a description of a city and the sort of bustle of the city, or I'm writing a description of a landscape and a very empty landscape, or I'm writing a description of a battle scene. For me, it's writing that intense sensory experience. It's writing about the emotion. It's writing about the sensory experiences, about the sight, the colour, the movement, about the sounds, the smells, the textures, and the feelings that evokes, and also the memories it evokes. So I think I'm probably mildly synesthetic. I'm also very severely, I can never pronounce it, that condition where you have that, it's basically, it's disgraced, technically it translates to the phobia of holes, but you have that thing, I have that thing about holes and textures, and that thing where if you see a lotus seed head, you start to scream.
Oh, I have a friend who has that. I can't remember the name of it.
It's not like topophobia, it's literally fear of holes. So yeah, that kind of, and I'm slightly hypersensitive to some materials. I'm Asperger's. And so I'm very, very kind of in experience and some visual things or some textures incredibly unpleasantly, or incredibly pleasantly. I've also got that thing with, thing where people like watching videos of people brushing their hair and things, and they find that, I can't remember the term for that either.
Is that ASMR? Or
yes, I get that very strongly as well. So for everything I'm writing, it's different parts of that experience. When I'm writing battle scenes, I often visualize footage of battles I've seen in films and things, and the sensory, the aesthetic experience of seeing that, which for me isn't that different between the sensory aesthetic experience of seeing, kind of being out in the landscape and the kind of sensations it evokes. So they're both enjoyable in different ways, essentially. They're both me doing kind of the same thing, I think, just in different settings.
Yes. Well, I don't see any more questions at this point. And actually, we do have to wrap up by 4, but that's 13 minutes from now. We have time. But are there any final thoughts that you would like to share with people, or any reminders of where people can find you and where they should look for you? And
yes, I suppose I should do that sort of stuff. Yes. I'm on Twitter as Queen of Grimdark, which there's a slightly unfair thing where people say, I proclaim myself that, which one, no, I didn't actually. As all hail the Queen of Grimdark Fantasy.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, there we are. But also, I mean, it's interesting. No one ever says about Joe Abercrombie, oh, well, he claims to be Lord Grimdark, does he? It's that kind of interesting. That's to say, it's interesting.
Yeah.
But yes, I have apologised personally to Joe Abercrombie also for the sheer number of people who think that who've made jokes about the fact am I married to him, or is he my or am I his daughter?
People are funny.
Someone drew up a little family tree of all the people on Twitter who have Queen of Grimdark or Lord Grimdark or Dad, Dark Dad, or all these people. I'm trying to work out how we all relate to each other. But so as Queen of Grimdark. I'm on Facebook as Anna Smith Spark, and I also have an author page, Anna Smith Spark. I'm the only Anna Smith Spark in the world, as far as anyone knows. So that's if you find it on Facebook.
That's useful.
I have a website called quarterbrokenknives.org.
Call to Broken Knives?
Quarterbrokenknives.org, which I don't update that often, but it's got some lovely, lovely fan art. And it's got some recipes in it as well. I've had fan recipes.
Oh, that's great. That's very exciting.
A couple of cocktail recipes and some cake recipe, and some wonderful fan art. I'm on Instagram as Anna Smith Spark as well. And actually, if anyone's in the UK, the Court of Broken Knives is a Kindle deal until the end of April. It's 99p on Kindle.
Oh, lovely.
Sacrifice has just come out in paperback in the UK, which is obviously fantastic timing. I've got a whole box of copies, and I'm supposed to be sending them out to reviewers. And I keep thinking, how much do I want a review versus how scared am I to go to the post office?
That'll be a dilemma for a little while, I think.
Yes.
Well, you just have to weigh that carefully.
I do what I want to die. Like, if I send them out to a reviewer and they give it anything less than 5 stars, I'll be like, dude, I could have died for that, sending you that.
Was it worth it? Considered an adventure. So it's like you're dropping the ring off in Mordor, but instead you're just taking books to the post.
Yes.
Stephen Richter informs us that your books are also on sale for the ebook versions in the US. So.
Oh, they are, right, cool. They were because they were a while ago, and cool. So they still are, cool.
Yeah. So that's how I'll go snag one of those.
Yes.
My Kindle account's a US account, so. Not that I wouldn't pay full price for them, but we are in the middle of a quarantine. And, always exciting to get excellent books for a discount.
I've kind of given the impression that they are described as nihilistic sometimes, but I actually think they're very much about hope, because I'm an incurably romantic. They are incurably romantic. Romantic. They are high fantasy. They're absolutely high fantasy. They're just from a slightly different perspective, perhaps. But they are fundamentally, they're about the ability of the human soul to survive a totally nihilistic, incredibly brutal, incredibly uncaring, bleak world. Which for me, as someone who realized pretty young that basically Lovecraft got it right in terms of at the center of the universe, there is the great chaos, mindless, gibbering chaos, Azathoth. And that's your god, folks. But within that totally bleak, uncaring, God is out there, and it's a huge void that wants to consume everything and destroy us. And there ain't no hope and there ain't no light. There is hope and there is light, because there's the human soul, and there's beauty, and there's the rain in the desert, and there's flowers, and there's Orhan and Dorothy love each other, and there's a baby, and the baby makes a lovely little laughing noise, and the baby's alive. And that they are fundamentally incredibly hopeful books.
Well, that's good.
How bleak the world is, and the world we are seeing at the moment, it's pretty damn bleak. We're still laughing.
Well, that's good. Hope is certainly a thing that we need more of right now. So that's a lovely message. I think now is probably a good time to wrap up. Thank you so very much for coming and reading for us and for joining our panels. And my apologies about the panel this morning. We are rescheduling that
Yes.
as we speak. And I'm
Yes.
so sorry about
We
that
should probably
technical.
have those as well quickly. Actually, got a panel tomorrow, I believe, at 4 p.m. UK time,
Yes.
which I have no idea what time that is.
It's 10 a.m. my time.
10 a.m.
10 a.m. Central. So yeah, sort it out from
4
there.
a.m. UK, 4 p.m. UK time. Talking about diversity in science fiction and fantasy, which is a panel I've talked on many times. At some point in the future, we maybe won't need to have that conversation, but
yeah, that'd be nice.
and then on Monday at 9 p.m. UK time, I'm talking about writing fighting and writing violence, which is something.
Oh yes, I'm also really looking forward to that. Those are both going to be really great panels.
Yep.
Excited about both of them. All right, so I'm going to disconnect us from being live. So thank you everyone for watching. Please remember to check out our Artist Alley and support the authors and crafters and artists that we have on there. Thank you so much again, Anna, and that's